This day in sports history. This episode is brought to you by Stirling Roastery. For several months you've heard me talking about the great products and scents offered by the Stirling Soap Company. And while there may not seem to be any correlation between soap and coffee, what is similar is the same care and attention to detail in delivering great products to their customers. Stirling Roastery will ship great-tasting beans or ground coffee, for whatever coffee-making process you prefer, right to your door. I gave their breakfast blend a try recently, and I can tell you, it was a great way to get my day kick-started with this smooth, medium blend. And just like their soaps, they have a variety to choose from. Give Stirling Roastery a try at stirlingsoap.com. It's September 11th, and on this day in 1985, Pete Rose became the all-time hits king in Major League Baseball. Or did it actually happen earlier? Pete Rose picked up his first hit in the major leagues on April 13, 1963. His 4,000th hit came exactly 21 years later. Between that time, a little closer to 1 than 4,000, Rose figured that he could be the Babe Ruth of singles. Rose was not a mad scientist or an evil genius working on how to get more hits in some baseball version of a beaker-filled dungeon. Sure, he studied pitchers and their tendencies, but he had a feel for the game and an anticipation of what was going to happen before it happened. Well, at this point in 1985, Rose was 44 years old, and he was the player-manager of the Cincinnati Reds, his hometown club, the team he'd broken into the majors with 23 seasons earlier. He'd been around the league a little bit. He spent some time in Philadelphia and Montreal before coming back home to spend the final years of his playing career chasing the record that he'd set his sights on back in 1963, Ty Cobb's seemingly unattainable record of 4,191 hits. Well, that's at least what everybody said. 4,191, it's impossible. Getting to 4,000, that's nearly impossible. But he had been consistent over his time in the majors. Good for about 200 hits a season, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little bit more. Rose picked up 2 hits and tied Cobb's mark of 4,191 on September 8th when the Reds were in Chicago, in a game that he really was not even supposed to be playing in. Now, as a player-manager, he could put himself in the lineup or not. Well, at this point, Rose was only hitting against right-handed pitchers. Left-hander Steve Trout was the scheduled starter for the Cubs on the 8th, and so Rose wasn't going to play. But Trout had a bicycling accident the night before, and he cut his pitching hand up enough that he couldn't grip the ball well. And so instead of the left-hander Trout, Cubs manager Jim Fry inserted right-hander Reggie Patterson. So Rose inserted himself into the lineup. He tied the record in the 8th inning, and then the rain came. Now, if there hadn't been a 2-hour rain delay, or if Wrigley Field had lights at that point, he may have broken the record of 4,191 on this night. But the rain did come, and the Cubs were still a few years from adding lights. When the game resumed as darkness began to fall, Rose came to the plate in a 5-5 game, but he grounded out to the third, and the game was stopped due to darkness soon after, ending in a 5-5 tie. And so, to this day now, the 11th of September, 1985, the Reds were back home against the San Diego Padres, facing right-hander Eric Schall. Here's the call from Marty Brenneman and Joe Nuxall from that day.
He levels the bat a couple of times. Schall kicks and he fires. Rose swings. There it is! There it is! Get out! Get out! All right! Hits number 4192. A line drive single into left center field. A clean base hit. And it is pandemonium here at Riverfront Stadium. The fireworks exploding overhead. The Cincinnati dugout has emptied. The applause continues unabated. Rose completely encircled Leone, the last two of the old guard from the Big Red Machine days of the 70s. And now as his teammates go back to the dugout, Reds owner Marge Schott comes out to give Pete a great big hug and a kiss. Joe, quite an emotional scene here at the ballpark. This outpouring of affection from this standing room only crowd as he turns a complete circle, waving and doffing his batting helmet to the crowd. And the folks on this date, September the 11th, certainly have not been disappointed one iota.
In true Charlie Hustle fashion, he'd pick up 41-93 later in the game when he tripled and he drove in 2 runs and a 2-0 win for the Reds. Rose would play another season and add another 62 hits to finish his 24-year career with 4,256 hits. Now, I said he sort of broke the record on this night, and let me explain what I mean by that. Rose actually broke Cobb's record in Chicago on the 8th. What, you say? All right, hang with me here for a second. In 1981, there was a statistical guy who went through all of Ty Cobb's games, and he found that there were 2 hits that he had been credited with that he actually didn't get. He informed Major League Baseball of this 4 years earlier, back in 1981, but the word had not yet drifted out to all the people who make the record books, and so here in 85, Ty Cobb was still listed with 4,191 hits. The record books have been updated now, so if you look at any record book, you will see Cobb with 4,189. So technically, he actually bested Cobb on September 8th in Chicago. But everybody celebrated on this day in 85, so it's the official day of Pete Rose passing Ty Cobb. On this day in 1906, 2 teammates got into a horrific fight during a game. This was a game between the New York Highlanders, who would eventually become the Yankees, and the Boston Americans, the forerunner of the Red Sox. Jack Hayden was the leadoff man that day for the Americans, and he opened the game with a solo home run. Boston added another in the inning to take an early 2-0 lead. New York struck back with 3 runs in the second, 1 in the third, and 3 in the fifth. During the 6th inning, the Highlanders' Frank Laporte came to the plate and he smacked a hard shot in between first and second, and he took off running. Hayden, playing right field, didn't exactly hustle after the ball, and as it rattled around in the outfield and rolled into foul territory, Laporte sprinted around the bases for an inside-the-park home run. The Highlanders added another couple of runs, and they took an 11-2 lead after the 6th. Second baseman Hobe Ferris was not happy with the seeming lack of effort on Hayden's part, and he started screaming at him. And once the final out of the inning was made, Ferris continued to scream at Hayden, calling him a lazy bum. The two shouted at each other as they continued to the dugout. Hayden screamed that, maybe the problem was that Ferris was too slow to cover ground in the infield. If he were a better player, a better fielder, maybe the ball wouldn't have gotten to the outfield. Ferris punched Hayden a few times on the head. They were separated by teammates, but the words continued. Ferris escaped his teammates' arms, and he pushed Hayden down on the bench. And then he kicked him in the face. Hayden lost several teeth as a result. Both men were ejected from the game, and police escorted them out of the ballpark and took them to the local precinct. Each man refused to file a complaint against the other, and a charge of disorderly conduct was later dismissed. The umpire that day was Silk O'Loughlin, and at an inquest about the incident a little later, he said, "It was the most cowardly act I have ever witnessed upon the ball field. I understand that even Ferris's wife upbraided him for kicking Hayden in the face." Hobe Ferris was suspended for the final 23 games of the season by the American League office, but he did play for Boston the following year. Hayden, however, was not welcomed back by the club. He missed the rest of the season with the injury, and he was still feeling the pain of the incident 2 months later. But while Ferris was indeed wrong to punch and kick his teammate in the face, he was not wrong about Hayden being slow, lazy, and not very good. Manager Chick Stahl, who played center field next to Hayden, said, "He was weak in covering ground and in throwing. I was compelled repeatedly to wander into his territory to get balls. There was no chance at all that he would be welcomed back." On this day in 1991, it was a no-hitter in Atlanta, but this was no ordinary no-hitter. Typically, a no-hitter is one guy pitching a solid 9 innings, walking a few, maybe a guy makes an error somewhere along the way, but he doesn't give up a hit. There's been the occasional 2-player combined no-hitter, like the famous Babe Ruth Ernie Shore no-hitter, which was really a perfect game by Shore, but we've already talked about that one on the podcast, so I'll leave that one alone. In fact, at this point in baseball history, there had just been 6 previous combined no-hitters, and interestingly enough, one of those 6 had been pitched just 2 months before. But what made this one unique is that it had never happened in the National League before. Well, on this night, Kent Mercker got the start. He went 6 complete innings, he threw 82 pitches, he walked 2, and he struck out 6. Then Mark Wohlers came out of the pen in the 7th, and he threw 2 complete innings, and then Alejandro Pena came on to close things out in the 9th in a 1-0 win over the Padres. Of course, San Diego had 0 hits on the night. On this day in 2015, it was one of the craziest games to ever be played on a high school gridiron. There was so much offense in this game that it led off SportsCenter later that night. This was a Pennsylvania Friday night high school tilt, with the Meadville Bulldogs visiting the DuBois Beavers. As one writer covering the game put it, Mansell Stadium has a large D at midfield for a game that featured absolutely none of it. The game was a contrast in styles, too. DuBois loved putting the ball in the air, going 4 and 5 wide on most plays throughout the night, and they were relentless in their aerial assault. Meadville, on the other hand, ran the wing T offense, and their ground attack was unstoppable. DuBois' sophomore quarterback Matt Miller was making his varsity debut that night, and if there is a better first game from a player at any level, I am prone not to believe that. Miller threw for a high school record 787 yards and tied the national prep record with 10 touchdown passes. Meadville was blessed with a speedy and elusive running back named Journey Brown. Brown rolled up 722 yards on the ground while scoring 10 touchdowns. The Bulldogs set a new high school rushing record with 1,004 yards in the game as a team. By the time the game ended, the scoreboard probably needed to be cooled down. Final score, Meadville 107, DuBois 90. The 197 combined points in the game were the most scored in a game since a Texas high school game from 1928. And on this day in 2010, it was a college football shocker that sent rumbles through Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. The 13th-ranked Virginia Tech Hokies were still stinging a little bit from a win that slipped through their fingers in a 3-point loss to number 3 Boise State the week before. James Madison had moved up to number 12 in the FCS rankings after an opening week trucking of Morehead State. The Hokies put points on the board first, taking a 10-zip lead after a field goal in the second quarter. But the Dukes quieted all but a little corner of Lane Stadium with this play.
There's a well-designed screen and some running room across the 30, 35, still going first down and more. It's a race to the end zone. On his way is Sullivan, and he's going to take it to the house. Touchdown, James Madison. That covers 78 yards.
That was one of only 8 passes that QB Jeff Dudzik threw on the day. The Dukes were content with shortening the game and running the football. Hokie quarterback Tyrod Taylor picked a bad day to have a bad day. He threw a pick late in the third quarter to squelch a promising drive and clinging to a 16-14 lead. The Dukes methodically drove down the field and punched one in to take a 21-16 lead at that point, but there was a lot of time to play, nearly the entire fourth quarter. The Hokies simply could not do anything with the football, though, and they made a ton of mistakes. They turned the ball over again on a fumble and then committed a roughing the punter penalty to sustain a JMU drive late in the afternoon. The Dukes hung on for the shocking win, snapping a 32-game home winning streak at Lane Stadium for the Hokies. After the loss, Virginia Tech's season got a whole lot better. They went on an 11-game winning streak and earned a berth to the Orange Bowl. The Dukes, however, suffered a bunch of injuries in the following weeks and struggled through a 5-game stretch of losses against ranked opponents, and they missed the playoffs. That time now for today's That's Got Nothing to Do with Sports Fun Fact. Over a 300-year period in Romania, if a married couple wanted to get a divorce, the church forced them to live in a one-room apartment with one bed, one plate, one fork, one spoon, one knife, and a stocked pantry for 2 weeks. The idea was to give the couple enough time to reevaluate their relationship. By the end of the experiment, if the couple still wanted a divorce, it was granted. According to church records, through 3 centuries of this procedure, surprisingly, only 2 couples ever went through with a divorce. This has been an original Thrive Suite production.